There are moments in war when the outcome of entire campaigns turns not on courage or tactics, but on something far more mundane: fuel, gasoline, the liquid that makes modern armies move. In the frozen forests of Belgium, in the grey dawn of December 17, 1944, one such moment arrived. This is the story of a theft, a desperate act by desperate men in a dying regime, a seizure of American fuel that would, for a few brief days, allow a German armoured column to penetrate deeper into Allied lines than anyone thought possible. It is the story of Joachim Peiper, an officer of the Schutzstaffel, and the 50,000 gallons that history would come to remember as the fuel that almost changed everything. But more than that, it is a story about the fatal arithmetic of total war, about what happens when an army runs dry. Chapter 1: The Desperation for Fuel. By December of 1944, Germany was choking. Not from lack of will, not from lack of men, though those were growing scarce. Germany was choking because its war machine had run out of the one resource it could not manufacture from determination alone: petroleum. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. Germany's synthetic fuel plants, built at enormous cost throughout the Third Reich, had once produced nearly 5 million tons of fuel per year. These plants were technological marvels, converting coal into liquid fuel through the Fischer-Tropsch process, a chemical achievement that had taken decades to perfect. They had been constructed in the Ruhr Valley, in Silesia, in central Germany, massive industrial complexes that consumed vast quantities of coal and electricity to produce the gasoline and diesel that kept the Wehrmacht moving. But by the autumn of 1944, Allied bombers had turned those plants into rubble. The campaign against German synthetic fuel production had begun in earnest in May of 1944. American heavy bombers, flying in daylight formations of hundreds of aircraft, systematically targeted every major fuel production facility in German-controlled territory: the Leuna works near Merseburg, the plants at Pörlitz, the refineries at Blechhammer. One by one they were struck, repaired, and struck again. By November, production had collapsed to less than 10% of what it had been 6 months earlier. What little fuel remained was consumed almost immediately by training flights, defensive operations, and the constant retreat on both fronts. The effects rippled through the entire German military structure. Pilots completed their training with only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had received. Panzer divisions were reorganized again and again, consolidating units, not because they lacked tanks, but because they lacked fuel to operate them. Truck convoys sat idle in depots. Supply officers performed grim calculations, measuring fuel in litres, rationing it like medicine in a plague. The Luftwaffe had largely ceased to exist as an offensive force, not because its pilots lacked skill, but because there was no fuel to put in their aircraft. On some days, the entire German Air Force over the Western Front could muster only a handful of sorties. Aircraft that had survived years of combat sat in revetments, fully armed and ready, their fuel tanks empty. Tanks sat immobile in depots, their crews drilling on foot because there was no fuel for manoeuvres. Trucks were abandoned on roadsides, cannibalized for parts. Horses, which had been relegated to secondary roles early in the war, returned to prominence, pulling supply wagons and artillery pieces as they had in the First World War. The German army, which had once raced across Poland and France with terrifying speed, now moved at the pace of horses and men on foot. This was the stranglehold that would kill the Third Reich. Not artillery, not infantry, fuel. And yet in December of 1944, Adolf Hitler ordered one final offensive, one last gamble. A thrust through the Ardennes forest aimed at splitting the Allied armies, recapturing the Belgian port of Antwerp, and forcing the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. It was called Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The Allies would come to know it as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious to the point of fantasy. 3 German armies would attack along a 50-mile front, punching through weakly held American positions in the Ardennes, crossing the Meuse River and driving all the way to Antwerp. Speed was essential, surprise was essential, and fuel above all was essential. But Germany did not have the fuel. The planners knew this, the field commanders knew this, even Hitler in his increasingly detached state must have known this. The offensive was allocated fuel sufficient for perhaps half the distance to its objectives, perhaps less. The rest, the planners grimly calculated, would have to be captured from the Americans. This was not tactics. This was desperation disguised as strategy. It was the military equivalent of robbing banks to finance your business. It might work once. It might work twice. But as the foundation of a major offensive involving hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of vehicles, it was madness. But Germany had no choice. There was no fuel reserve to draw upon. There was no miracle weapon that would suddenly restore mobility to the Wehrmacht. There was only this: attack now, attack fast, and hope that American fuel dumps could be captured before the panzers ground to a halt. And so the orders went out. Armoured units were to seize American fuel dumps wherever they found them. Captured gasoline would be used immediately. There would be no time to wait for supply columns. The panzers would have to live off the enemy's land like raiders in some earlier age of warfare. One unit, above all others, was expected to move fast and strike deep. Kampfgruppe Peiper, part of the 1st Schutzstaffel Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler. Its commander was a man named Joachim Peiper. He was 30 years old. Chapter 2. The March of Kampfgruppe Peiper. Joachim Peiper was not a general, despite what popular memory would later call him. His rank was Schutzstaffel Obersturmbannführer, equivalent to lieutenant colonel in conventional military terms. But in the structure of the Waffenschutzstaffel, the armed wing of the Schutzstaffel, he commanded a battle group of approximately 5,000 men and over 100 armoured vehicles. Kampfgruppe Peiper was the spearhead of the spearhead. The composition of the battle group reflected Germany's remaining armoured strength, approximately 70 tanks, including the massive Tiger II heavy tanks, Panther medium tanks, and lighter Mark IV tanks. There were also half-tracks, armoured reconnaissance vehicles, towed artillery, anti-aircraft guns, and trucks. It was a combined arms force designed for rapid exploitation, for breaking through defensive lines and racing deep into enemy territory before the defender could react. Peiper himself was a veteran of the Eastern Front, a decorated officer known for aggressive tactics and ruthless efficiency. He had fought in Russia, in Poland, in Italy. He had received the Knight's Cross. He had served briefly on the personal staff of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the Schutzstaffel. He was intelligent, disciplined, and absolutely committed to the cause he served. He was also, by the winter of 1944, aware that Germany was losing the war. But awareness does not mean surrender. Peiper's orders were clear: break through the American lines, race west to the Meuse River, and do not stop. Do not wait for infantry. Do not wait for supplies. Move fast, move hard, and capture what you need along the way. In the early hours of December 16th, 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper crossed the German border into Belgium. The weather was overcast, cold, and miserable. Fog clung to the valleys. The roads were narrow, winding forest tracks that turned to mud under the weight of heavy armour. These were not the highways of France. These were logging roads, farm paths, routes meant for horses and light vehicles. For a column of Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, and half-tracks, it was a grinding, frustrating advance. The initial barrage had begun at 5:30 in the morning. German artillery, massed in concentrations not seen in the West since 1940, pounded American positions. Searchlights bounced off low clouds, creating an artificial moonlight that illuminated the battlefield in ghostly white. Then the infantry attacked, moving forward through the snow and fog. Peiper's column was supposed to follow immediately, exploiting any breakthrough. But the breakthrough did not come quickly. American units, though surprised and outnumbered, did not collapse. They fought from foxholes and farmhouses. They blew bridges. They blocked roads with disabled vehicles. The narrow roads became the curse of the offensive. A single disabled tank could block an entire column. A single determined squad with anti-tank weapons could delay hundreds of vehicles for hours. Peiper's advance, which was supposed to be lightning fast, became a brutal crawl. The Americans were unprepared in the strategic sense, yes. The Ardennes sector had been considered quiet, a place to rest battered divisions and train new ones. When the German barrage began, it caught units of the 99th Infantry Division and the 14th Cavalry Group by surprise. But surprise does not mean collapse. The American defenders fought back, and they fought hard. Crossroads were contested. Villages became fortresses. By nightfall on the first day, Kampfgruppe Peiper had advanced only a few miles. The unit was behind schedule. Vehicles were breaking down, and fuel was already becoming a problem. This was the great paradox of the German offensive. The units expected to move fastest were also the units that consumed fuel fastest. A Tiger tank with its massive weight and powerful engine devoured gasoline at an astonishing rate. Under ideal road conditions, a Tiger might travel 60 miles on a full tank. But these were not ideal conditions. These were steep hills, muddy tracks, cross-country movement through fields and forests. Under combat conditions, travelling cross-country or through difficult terrain, fuel consumption doubled or tripled. In the Ardennes, that range was cut in half or worse. Peiper's column needed fuel, desperately. And on the morning of December 17th, 1944, they found it. But first they had to take Honsfeld. Honsfeld was a small village, home to perhaps a few hundred people, straddling one of the few decent roads in the region. According to Cole's history, it was being used as a rest area for American units, including elements of the 99th Infantry Division and various support units. Kampfgruppe Peiper hit Honsfeld at dawn. The Americans were still waking up when the first German tanks rolled into the village. There was fighting, brief and chaotic. Some Americans fled toward the west, abandoning equipment. Others were captured, emerging from billets with their hands up. A few pockets resisted, firing from buildings until they were overrun. Within an hour, Honsfeld had fallen. Peiper's men captured vehicles, weapons and supplies. More importantly, they captured prisoners. Dozens of American soldiers were rounded up, disarmed, and assembled under guard. The column needed to keep moving. Every minute spent in Honsfeld was a minute that allowed American reinforcements to organize. Peiper knew this. His orders were to move fast, always fast. But then came the decision that would define the next phase of the battle. Instead of continuing directly west toward his assigned route, Peiper diverted north to the village of Büllingen. Chapter 3: The Fuel at Büllingen. The decision to divert to Büllingen was not impulsive. According to Hugh M. Cole's authoritative history, the Ardennes Battle of the Bulge, published by the United States Army Center of Military History, intelligence reports had indicated that Büllingen contained American supply dumps. In the calculations of Kampfgruppe Peiper's officers, already watching their fuel gauges with growing concern, the possibility of captured supplies was worth a detour of a few kilometers. The route from Honsfeld to Büllingen ran north through rolling farmland, across fields covered in snow, past hedgerows and scattered woods. It was not a long distance, perhaps 3 or 4 miles, but for a column of heavy armour moving cross-country, it consumed precious time and fuel. Büllingen was slightly larger than Honsfeld, a farming community built around a central crossroads. Before the war, its inhabitants had made their living from agriculture and small trade. Now, in December of 1944, it was being used as a rear area supply point by the 99th Infantry Division. American trucks, supply dumps, and administrative units had been positioned there, away from what had been, until 2 days earlier, a quiet front. The village had not been reinforced. Why would it be? The fighting was supposed to be miles away, contained along the border. Büllingen was a supply depot, a place where clerks and quartermasters worked, where fuel and ammunition were stockpiled for forward units. When Peiper's lead elements entered Büllingen on the morning of December the 17th, they encountered minimal resistance. Some American soldiers fled toward the west, jumping into trucks and jeeps and racing down the snow-covered roads. Others, caught completely by surprise, surrendered immediately. A few shots were fired, a few Americans tried to organize a defense, but within minutes it was over. The village fell so quickly that the Germans captured it almost intact, and then Peiper's men found what they had been looking for: fuel. The American fuel dump at Büllingen was not a major strategic depot. It was not the kind of massive supply facility that would later be established as the Allies pushed into Germany. It was, by the standards of American logistics, a modest forward stockpile. But for Kampfgruppe Peiper, it was a lifeline. The exact nature of the fuel dump is described in Cole's history as a collection of jerry cans and fuel storage containers, part of the standard supply infrastructure of an American infantry division. These were the 5-gallon metal cans painted olive drab, stacked in pyramids beside the road, or stored in captured Belgian barns and sheds. There may have been some larger containers as well, 50-gallon drums that required pumps or gravity feed to transfer their contents. The quantity was substantial. How substantial exactly is the question that has occupied historians ever since. Cole's account confirms that Peiper ordered his vehicles to refuel at Büllingen, and that American prisoners were used to assist in the refueling operation. This was not unusual in the chaos of rapid armoured advances. Captured soldiers were often put to work on immediate logistical tasks, particularly when time was critical and German personnel were needed for security and combat operations. The refuelling operation took several hours. This was not a quick stop at a modern gas station. This was combat refuelling, done by hand, under pressure, with inadequate equipment. Tanks pulled up to the supply dump in sequence, guided by German officers and non-commissioned officers who organised the flow of vehicles to prevent congestion. Each tank required several hundred gallons to fill its fuel tanks completely. The Tiger tanks, with their enormous weight and powerful engines, needed the most. Panthers needed somewhat less. Mark IV tanks, lighter and more fuel efficient, needed less still. But even a Mark IV required over 100 gallons for a full tank. Jerry cans were hauled from the stockpiles, carried by hand or loaded onto trucks and driven to the refuelling points. American prisoners worked under guard, lifting the heavy metal cans, unscrewing the caps, pouring fuel into the tank's intake ports. It was brutal physical labour. Each 5-gallon can weighed over 40 pounds when full. Multiply that by dozens of cans per tank, dozens of tanks in the column, and the scale of the operation becomes clear. German soldiers supervised, weapons ready, watching the prisoners work. Peiper himself moved through the village, checking on progress, issuing orders, calculating how much time this was costing him. Every minute spent refueling was a minute that American reinforcements could be moving toward him. Every minute was a minute that the offensive's precious momentum was bleeding away. But without fuel, there would be no movement at all. So the work continued. It was, in its way, a moment of terrible absurdity. American gasoline paid for by American taxpayers, transported across the Atlantic by American merchant ships, distributed through American supply networks, was now being used to fuel German tanks that would kill American soldiers. The prisoners poured fuel into the tanks that would soon fire on their comrades. The Germans watched them work, understanding the grim irony but caring only about the outcome. War strips away everything but necessity. But how much fuel was there? This is where the historical record becomes less certain. Kohl's official history does not specify the quantity of fuel captured at Büllingen. It confirms the event, describes the refueling operation, and notes that the captured fuel allowed Peiper to continue his advance, but it does not provide a number. The number comes from later sources. According to the Marine Corps University Press edition of Oil and War, published decades after the battle, Kampfgruppe Peiper captured approximately 50,000 gallons of gasoline at Büllingen. This figure is repeated in a land warfare paper published by the Association of the United States Army. Both sources cite the 50,000-gallon figure as the approximate quantity seized during the refueling operation on December 17, 1944, 50,000 gallons. To understand what that meant, one must understand the scale of consumption in an armoured battle group. A single Tiger tank under combat conditions might consume 200 gallons or more in a day of heavy fighting. A Panther consumed somewhat less, perhaps 150 gallons. Half-tracks, trucks and lighter vehicles consumed less still, but there were dozens of them. Kampfgruppe Peiper consisted of over 100 armoured and motorised vehicles. Its daily fuel consumption, under combat conditions, was immense. 50,000 gallons represented perhaps 2 or 3 days of intensive operations, maybe less if the fighting was particularly severe or the terrain particularly difficult. But 2 or 3 days was enough. It was enough to keep moving. Enough to maintain the momentum that was the only thing preventing the entire offensive from collapsing into a traffic jam of immobilised tanks. The refuelling at Büllingen was completed by early afternoon on December 17th. Peiper's column, now replenished, prepared to move out. The tanks, which had been running dangerously low, now had full tanks again. The half-tracks and trucks had been topped off. Even the jerry cans carried on the vehicles for emergency refuelling had been filled. Behind them, they left a village in shock. American supply personnel were prisoners or scattered. Equipment was destroyed or captured. Buildings had been damaged in the brief fight. And the fuel that was supposed to sustain American operations in the Ardennes was now propelling German tanks toward the Meuse River. Peiper ordered the march to continue. The column turned west again, grinding out of Büllingen and heading toward the next objective, the town of Stavelot, and beyond it the critical bridges over the Meuse. The general who stole the gas was moving again. Chapter 4. The Aftermath. The fuel from Büllingen bought Peiper time, but it did not buy him victory. By the evening of December 17th, Kampfgruppe Peiper had reached the outskirts of Stavelot, a town straddling the Amblev River. The Americans there, elements of the 7th Armoured Division, and various engineer units, were hurriedly preparing defences. Bridges had been wired for demolition. Roadblocks were being thrown up. The easy breakthrough was ending. Stavelot sat in a valley, the river running through its centre, stone buildings clustering on both banks. The town controlled one of the few crossing points in the region. Beyond it lay the road to the Meuse. Peiper needed Stavelot, needed it desperately, but the Americans at Stavelot had been warned. Radio reports from Honsfeld and Büllingen had reached them. They knew something was coming. They did not know exactly what. Reports were confused, numbers wildly inconsistent, but they knew it was big, and it was moving fast. Peiper attacked that night, a risky night assault through narrow streets with poor visibility. The lead German tanks pushed into the town, firing at windows and doorways. Americans fired back with everything they had: rifles, machine guns, bazookas. The fighting was close and brutal. The assault was repulsed. The Americans blew one bridge just as German tanks approached it. The explosion lit up the night, and when the smoke cleared, the crossing was gone, the bridge deck sagging into the river. But Peiper found another route. His reconnaissance units discovered a bridge that had not been demolished, a smaller crossing on the edge of town. German tanks forced their way across, and by the morning of December 18th, part of Kampfgruppe Peiper was on the west side of the Amblev. But the situation was deteriorating. American reinforcements were arriving constantly now. The initial shock of the German offensive was wearing off. Units were being rushed toward the Ardennes from across the front. Traffic jams clogged the roads as divisions raced toward the sound of the guns. And American air power, grounded by bad weather during the first days of the offensive, was beginning to appear. Fighter bombers, flying below the overcast, strafed German columns. Artillery fire increased, directed by forward observers who radioed coordinates back to gun batteries positioned on ridgelines. Over the next several days, Kampfgruppe Peiper pushed forward to the village of Stoumont, and then to the hamlet of Gleize. At each point, American resistance stiffened. At Stoumont, American tanks from the 3rd Armoured Division engaged Peiper's Panthers in close-range combat. Buildings were shelled, streets became killing zones. The Germans took Stoumont, but at a cost. Tanks were lost, men were killed, and fuel, always fuel, was being consumed. At Gleize, a tiny village of stone houses perched on a hilltop, Kampfgruppe Peiper ground to a halt. American units had surrounded the position. Artillery pounded the village day and night. Attempts to break through and continue the advance toward the Meuse failed, and the fuel began to run out. By December 19th, just 2 days after the refueling at Büllingen, Peiper's advance had stalled completely. The unit was essentially surrounded, cut off from German lines by American counterattacks. The roads behind them, the narrow forest tracks they had used to advance, were now controlled by American forces. Supply columns trying to reach Kampfgruppe Peiper were destroyed or turned back. Attempts to resupply the battle group by air failed. The Luftwaffe tried, sending transport planes loaded with fuel and ammunition to drop supplies over Gleize. But the weather was terrible, visibility was poor, and American anti-aircraft fire was intense. Some drops missed the target completely, the precious supplies falling into American hands. Other planes were shot down. The trickle of supplies that did get through was nowhere near enough. The arithmetic that had doomed the German offensive from the beginning now asserted itself with finality. Peiper's tanks, immobilized by lack of fuel, became stationary targets. They could not maneuver, they could not retreat, they could only sit in place and fire at approaching American forces until their ammunition ran out. On December the 22nd, after 5 days of encirclement, Peiper made the decision that every commander dreads. He would abandon his vehicles and break out on foot. It was the only option left. The tanks could not be moved, they could not be defended, they could not be supplied. All that remained was to destroy them so they would not fall intact into American hands, and then to try to slip through enemy lines in small groups. The order went out in the pre-dawn darkness. Engineers moved from tank to tank, placing demolition charges. Fuel tanks were drained of what little remained, and the fuel was used to set fires. Ammunition was destroyed. Radios were smashed. Weapons were spiked or thrown into the river. And then, As dawn broke on December 23rd, the charges detonated. Tiger tanks, Panthers, Mark IVs, half-tracks, all the armoured might of Kampfgruppe Peiper were destroyed by their own crews. The explosions echoed through the valleys. Flames rose into the grey winter sky. The surviving members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, perhaps 800 men out of the 5,000 who had begun the offensive, slipped out of Gleize in small groups. They moved through forests, crossed frozen streams, avoided roads. Some were captured, some were killed in brief firefights, but some, including Peiper himself, made it back to German lines. Of the approximately 100 armoured vehicles that had begun the offensive, not one made it back to German lines intact. The fuel from Büllingen had allowed Kampfgruppe Peiper to advance farther than any other German unit in the Ardennes offensive. At its furthest point, the unit had penetrated nearly 30 miles into American-held territory, closer to the Meuse than any other element of the German assault. Closer, but not close enough. The Meuse bridges remained in Allied hands. The drive to Antwerp had failed. But 30 miles was not enough. The Meuse was never reached. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The offensive ground to a halt, not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because German trucks, tanks, and half-tracks lacked gasoline. By the end of January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German army in the west had been shattered. Casualties numbered in the tens of thousands. Equipment losses were catastrophic. And critically, the fuel reserves that had been hoarded for the offensive were gone. Germany would never again launch a major offensive operation in the west. The 50,000 gallons stolen at Büllingen had bought a few extra days of advance, nothing more. Chapter 5. Legacy and Myth. In the decades after the war, the story of Joachim Peiper and the fuel at Büllingen took on a life of its own. It became, in popular memory, a dramatic turning point. The moment when German panzers, running on empty, stumbled onto a treasure trove of American gasoline and kept the offensive alive. The image was vivid. Desperate tank commanders, American prisoners hauling jerry cans, the roar of engines starting up again with captured fuel. The story appeared in memoirs, histories, documentaries, and books. Often it was told with a certain dark admiration for German resourcefulness, for the audacity of seizing enemy supplies in the midst of battle. Sometimes the quantity of fuel was exaggerated, growing from 50,000 gallons to 100,000 or more in retellings. Sometimes the significance was overstated, the captured fuel portrayed as the reason Kampfgruppe Peiper nearly succeeded rather than merely one factor among many. But the core story was true. Peiper did divert to Büllingen. His unit did find American fuel. The fuel was captured and used. American prisoners did assist in the refueling, and the captured supplies did allow Kampfgruppe Peiper to continue its advance when it might otherwise have stalled on December 17th, mere miles from the German border. The question of exactly how much fuel was captured remains to this day a matter of some uncertainty. The official United States Army history by Hugh M. Cole does not provide a specific figure. The 50,000-gallon number comes from later analyses, secondary sources that attempted to quantify what Cole's contemporary account left unspecified. Does this mean the number is wrong? Not necessarily. It means it should be understood as an estimate, a figure derived from post-war analysis rather than from battlefield reports filed in December of 1944. It is the kind of detail that gets filled in later, when historians have time to sift through quartermaster records, prisoner interrogations, and unit-after-action reports. What matters ultimately is not the precise number. What matters is what the story reveals about the Battle of the Bulge and about the final year of the war in Europe. The Battle of the Bulge was not lost because German soldiers lacked courage or German commanders lacked skill. It was lost because Germany lacked fuel. The entire offensive was predicated on the fantastical assumption that an army could fight its way across 100 miles of enemy territory while capturing the fuel it needed along the way. It was a plan born of desperation, not realism. The fuel at Büllingen could not change that fundamental reality. It could only postpone the inevitable. Even if Peiper had captured twice as much fuel, even if he had found fuel at every village along his route, the outcome would have been the same. The Germans could not sustain mechanized warfare without a secure fuel supply, and by December of 1944, that supply no longer existed. Joachim Peiper survived the war. He was tried for war crimes related to the massacre of American prisoners at Malmedy, an event that occurred during the same December offensive, though not at Büllingen. The massacre at Malmedy, where over 80 American prisoners were murdered by members of Kampfgruppe Peiper on December 17th, the same day as the refuelling at Büllingen, remains one of the most infamous atrocities of the Battle of the Bulge. Peiper was convicted in 1946 and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted. He was imprisoned until 1956, then released and lived quietly in Germany and later France. He worked in the automobile industry, kept a low profile, avoided publicity. But his past followed him. In 1976 he was killed when his house in France was firebombed, the circumstances of his death remaining disputed and controversial. Kampfgruppe Peiper became a case study in military schools, analysed for its tactics, its speed, its aggression. But it also became a cautionary tale about the limits of operational audacity when logistics fail. You can have the best tanks, the best soldiers, the best commanders, but if you run out of fuel, none of it matters. The 50,000 gallons of captured fuel became a footnote in larger histories, a detail that illuminated a broader truth. By December of 1944, Germany's war machine was running on fumes and stolen gasoline. The tanks were excellent, the soldiers were experienced, the commanders were capable. But none of that mattered without fuel. The Battle of the Bulge would be the last major German offensive of the Second World War. By spring, the war in Europe would be over. The Third Reich would collapse not in a climactic battle, but in a logistical disintegration, an army unable to move, unable to fight, unable even to retreat effectively because it had nothing left to burn. The general who stole the gas had stolen only a little more time, and time in December of 1944 was the one thing Germany could no longer buy, beg, borrow, or steal. Source note. The events described in this documentary are drawn from verified historical sources, with attention to the distinction between contemporaneous military records and later analytical works. The primary source for the movements of Kampfgruppe Peiper and the capture of fuel at Büllingen is Hugh M. Cole's The Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, published by the United States Army Center of Military History in 1965. Cole's work, part of the official United States Army and World War II series, is based on after-action reports, unit histories, and extensive interviews conducted shortly after the war. It confirms that Peiper diverted to Büllingen on December 17, 1944, captured American fuel supplies, and used American prisoners to assist in refueling operations. It does not specify the exact quantity of fuel captured. The figure of 50,000 gallons appears in later secondary sources, specifically the Marine Corps University Press edition of Oil and War, and a land warfare paper published by the Association of the United States Army. These sources provide quantitative analysis based on post-war research and quartermaster records. While these figures are widely cited in military historical literature, they represent estimates and analysis conducted years after the events, rather than battlefield documentation from December 1944. No dialogue in this documentary has been invented, no scenes have been dramatized beyond what the historical record supports. Where sources differ, or where the record is uncertain, that uncertainty has been acknowledged. The story of the fuel at Büllingen reflects a broader and incontrovertible truth. By December of 1944, the German military's critical weakness was not manpower, morale, or equipment quality, but fuel. The Battle of the Bulge, for all its tactical complexity and human cost, was ultimately lost because Germany could not sustain mechanized warfare without petroleum. The capture of 50,000 gallons, whether that number is exact or approximate, changed the timeline of Kampfgruppe Peiper's advance by perhaps 48 to 72 hours. It did not change the outcome of the battle, the offensive, or the war. This is history as it happened, desperate, complex, and marked by small moments that illuminate larger truths.